This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam, and I'm your host. And joining me, as always is the case, is
the indubitable
Dr. Richard Blackaby.
Good to be with you, Sam.
Oh, it's always a pleasure, Richard, and it just never gets old.
No,
thankfully.
I get old, but this doesn't.
Time keeps on slipping into the future, but here we are yet again. And this week we're going back to the Old Testament, and
the Old Testament.
The Old Testament, not the new one, the old one. But looking at a very famous passage of Scripture, and perhaps how this applies to leaders.
Yeah.
It'll be an adventure to see how we get there. So
yeah. Well, I thought we looked this week at Jeremiah chapter 29. Jeremiah, by the way, if you haven't read that, it's one of the richest Old Testament books, one of the richest prophetic books.
One of the most used books for graduation.
Yeah, at least this chapter. And so, of course, we're most familiar with Jeremiah 29, verse 11, which says, "For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, says the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope." And many a graduation speech has challenged people with that. And the interesting thing with Scripture is that it's all true. I believe the Old and the New Testament, every word of it is true. But you also need to know the context in which things are spoken. You can pull out a verse all by itself and make it sound to address whatever you want. But this has an interesting context. And verse 1 of chapter 29 says, "Now these are the words of the letter that Jeremiah the prophet sent from Jerusalem to the remainder of the elders who were carried away captive, to the priests, the prophets, and all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had carried away captive from Jerusalem to Babylon. This happened after Jeconiah, who's also known as Jehoiakim, the king, the queen mother, the eunuchs, the princes of Judah and Jerusalem, the craftsmen and the smiths had departed from Jerusalem." So basically this is a letter that Jeremiah writes. Now Jeremiah is still based in Jerusalem. He's still trying to convince the people that judgment is coming. And in about 597 or so, the king of Babylon comes to Jerusalem, and he actually takes the king away. And he takes a lot of the leaders away, a lot of the craftsmen, the princes, the skilled leaders. And so at that time, he takes Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, all those folks. He takes them all away. And so then they have to basically come up with a new king in Jerusalem. And so they end up with Zedekiah, who's going to end up being the last king of Israel, and he's going to get blinded, and he'll be taken to Babylon too eventually. But the Jews always saw Jehoiakim as their real king because he was taken in exile. He lived there for over 30 years. And so all these leaders are taken away to Babylon, and so there were some false prophets who arose, and they assured all these people in Babylon, you won't be there long. I mean, God won't let the king of Israel just live in exile. And so, keep your bags packed, because before long, God will reverse all of this, and he'll restore Jerusalem and so on. And so Jeremiah, he wasn't a pessimist, but he just told the truth. And sometimes the truth wasn't pleasant. And he basically writes this letter, and he says, no, don't believe these false prophets. That's what you want to believe, but it's not the truth. And so he writes this letter, and he says in verse 4, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all who were carried away captive, whom I have caused to be carried away." So God's saying, hey, you're where you are because that was my will for you. That wasn't an accident. That wasn't an aberration. You're right where I intend for you to be right now.
Yeah.
But then he says, build houses and dwell in them. Plant gardens and eat their fruit. Take wives and beget sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters to husbands, so that they may bear sons and daughters, that you may be increased there and not diminished. And seek the peace of the city, where I have caused you to be carried away captive, and pray to the Lord for it. For in its peace you will have peace. And so, so then, by the time you get to verse 11, Jeremiah is saying God does have a plan for you. He does have intentions and thoughts toward you, and it is good. It's just not what you were hoping for.
Right.
You were hoping that the word was coming, hey, pack your bags back up because you're coming back to Jerusalem.
You're going home.
This exile is just very temporary, and you're going to get to go home like you wanted to. And that doesn't usually get mentioned in graduation speeches. God does have a wonderful plan for your life. It's 70 years of exile.
Yeah.
So, but what God does say is, but where you are right now, it's not where you want to be, but it's where God intends for you to be. And so
that's such a powerful reframing of that idea.
And so what God is saying is, so he says, so settle down, like unpack your bags, build houses, raise your kids, he says, get them married off, like think about the generations to come. I think about your grandkids, and then he goes on to say as well, and seek the peace of the city that you're in. In other words, be a good neighbor. Look around and see, where has God put me, and who has he put me around? And basically, how can I be a blessing to them? Because he says, when the city you're in has peace, then guess what? You have peace. And so when your neighbors are all in a good space, well, then that's going to be good for you. You're going to have good neighbors. And so basically, he's saying, I know that you're really hoping that this is really short time here, and then you move on to a different place, but you'll be here for a while, and you'll be there long enough that you need to invest in where God's put you right now. And so I think there's some great application for us in this. And one thing I think we can take from this is that God has a purpose for where you are right now. Yeah. And a lot of us are kind of looking down the road. We're looking at where we'll ultimately be, where we want to be. Maybe I'm in this kind of lower management job right now, but I see myself getting up to at least a VP one day. Or right now I'm in this sales job, and I'm traveling a lot. And so what's even the point of, getting involved in my local church? Because I travel a lot now. But once I get off this job, then I'll maybe get more involved in my church. Or this is a starter home we're in. I don't plan to live in it more than 2-3 years. So why get to know the neighbors? We're not. This is not our permanent neighborhood. And I'm moving up the ladder here. So why even get to know a lot of my colleagues right now? Because I'll be leaving them all behind as I move on to the next level. And what Jeremiah is trying to say is that's a bad approach to life. And one thing we tried to always teach our kids was, wherever you are, be all in, be 100% in, whatever activity, I've got 2 grandsons, that are 6, and they just finished kindergarten. And we try to teach all of our kids and our grandkids, look, whatever activity the teacher has for you, whatever activity your parents have, just don't whine and complain and say, I don't want to do that, or, I want to do something else. Just get all in, and you'll discover that you can have fun in whatever it is you're doing. And so it was interesting at the end of the year, their teacher brought my daughter-in-law aside and my wife and just said, these are the most delightful kids I've ever had to work with. Like, whatever we were doing, they were all in, and they always had a good attitude. And I'm thinking, well, if you live your whole life that way, you end up having a pretty good life. And it doesn't mean that you're always in the place you wanted to be. But while you were there, you got the most out of it.
Yeah, well, that's such a powerful, once again, reframing of things, because I think everybody believes that God has an ultimate plan for their life. They have a future plan, like God has a purpose that is somewhere in the distant future or the near future. But to realize that, no, God has a purpose for you today, and where you are today, and that doesn't include necessarily moving you from where you are now. And that's a powerful shift in focus.
Yeah, it's like I'm going to really be happy once I get that job and I live in that town by my parents and where I've always wanted to be. And God would say, no, I've got a plan for your life, and it's for every day of your life, not just once you have the job you want or the house you want or the marriage you want, but where you are right now. And so what I thought we'd just talk for a moment about what I call concentric circles of blessing. And that is that what I think God is saying to the Jewish people here is, you need to be a blessing wherever I have you right now. And it needs to be kind of an ever widening circle of blessing. And so at the center of blessing, I think, should be yourself. I think you should be a blessing to yourself wherever God has you right now. So, you may be in you might be in a job that you don't intend to stay in for long. You might be in a house, a neighborhood you don't plan to spend the next 20 years in. You're kind of passing through this place. You right now, maybe you took this job in this city. You don't like the city that much. You don't know anyone there. You don't want to spend the rest of your life there. But so I've known people like this. Like, they just kind of kept to themselves. Nobody really got to know them very well. They put in their time at the office, and then they were gone, and they just didn't open themselves up much because they thought, why bother? I won't be here long. But I think God would say, well, but you're missing out on a blessing yourself. I mean, for instance, maybe you grew up on the coast and you love the beach, but right now God's got you living by the mountains. And so it's like, well, I could just hardly wait to get back to the coast where I can, get back to the beach or whatever. But God might say, but I've got you by mountains right now. Why don't you take up hiking? Why don't you take up photography? Why don't you take up skiing? You won't be here for long, but 5 years, if you're here 5 years, if you're here 1 year, you could go on some great hikes. You could have some great experiences with me you've never had before. You could develop some new skills, maybe make some friends that are hikers as well, that you go with from work. So don't put your life on hold until you finally are in the place you want to be. God has a plan for your life right now. And so wherever God has you right now, if you look around, you're going to discover that there's some ways that God wants to bless you right now in the job you're in. And even if it's only a starter house, it's only a starter job, don't miss what's there. You might make some of the best friends you ever have in your life while you're down at this level, at this place. And you might only end up going to that church for 3 years before you move on to your next assignment. But in those 3 years, you could have some amazing encounters with God and get to know some people that become lifelong friends of yours ever after. And so don't miss that because you're looking down the line and saying, well, that's what I'm aiming for, and the sooner I get there, the better.
Well, you end up missing life today because you're constantly thinking about life in the future. Yeah. And, sometimes that future never arrives, and you've missed out on everything that God intended for you today.
It's kind of the analogy of, it's not just the destination, it's the journey. And the journey may take you through some places that you're not going to reside all of your life at, but as you're passing by, get those experiences. And so I would say the same goes with family. Be a blessing, not just to yourself, wherever God has you, but be a blessing to your family. And again, I've known some people, and I would probably put myself in this category, that when your kids are younger, you're trying to build your career, and you're trying to learn the ropes and develop your skills and make a name for yourself or whatever it is you're trying to do. And so sometimes you can actually neglect your kids because you're so focused on trying to kind of get out of where you are and move up the ladder or earn more money or whatever it might be. And I remember one time just dashing into my house. I was just having a really busy day at work, and I had to go out for the evening, and I was running late, and I kind of dashed into the house, and my kids had been playing in the kitchen floor with Legos, and I'm trying to not step on any Legos as I'm hurriedly running back into my room to get something I need for my next thing. And I remember at the time I was so distracted that I just felt like these little kids of mine were just like stumbling block. They're just like in my way. Like, just could these kids just get out of my way here? I've got
Don't they know this
all
is
this
not where
to
you
do.
play with Legos?
And it just dawned on me as I'm dodging these kids, just racing past them, that where I was in my work life at the time was not necessarily being a blessing to them. And I realized, ultimately in that particular church, I was there just 4 years. But our families ended up making some really good friends there, making some really good memories. And to this day, I still have people Facebook messaging me and sharing comments with me that, and I haven't lived there in, I think, 26 years now, but that was just you could call it just sort of a pit stop, a 4-year stop in the midst of my career. But our kids made some really fun friends at that time. Our kids made a lot of memories, and we still look back at pictures at some of the places that we went with those kids and did. And we didn't have as much money then. We didn't have as nice of a house then. There were a lot of things were just sort of temporary, but you can make some great memories in some temporary, humble abodes and situations.
This fall, Blackaby Ministries is hosting 2 spiritual leadership coaching workshops. One in the Atlanta area and the other is fully online. The focus of these workshops are learning how to ask the right questions to help move people onto God's agenda. The online workshop is September 13th through the 15th, and the in-person workshop is October 21st through the 23rd. To find out more and to register, visit blackabycoaching.org. Links will be in the show notes.
The same goes for a church. I've got some dear friends that I made way back when I was just a teenager, Bob and Janice Adams. Bob passed away last year, but I've never seen people like this before. Bob was a researcher, and he came up to Saskatoon when I lived there. He was going to work at the university for, I think, about 6 months or so. And so they're only going to be in the city for 6 months. They've never lived in Canada before. But the very first Sunday, they come and visit our church. And the very first Sunday, they invited the pastor, which is my dad, and his family out for lunch, and just wanted to be a blessing. And we didn't get to eat out very much then. We were poor, this family of 7. And we thought that was so cool. And then Bob and Janice just began, as they talked to my parents, to say, what needs do you have in your church? These were veteran Christians, lifelong church members, leaders. And when my parents began to share the kind of programs that they wished we had for kids, which we didn't have a summer camp at the time, didn't have a boys club at the time. They just began to start stuff, and they were only there 6 months. And then they came back a couple years later. They had a chance to come back and do some more research there. I think they might have spent maybe up to a year. And the same thing, the first youth camp I ever went to in Canada was one that these guys started. And they were just temporary, like passing through. But their attitude was, if we're here 3 months or a year, what blessing could we leave behind before we go? And so Bob, when he died, really tragically of a serious illness last year, I flew all the way to Utah just to be at the funeral and just to speak and say, this man, I never lived around him all that long, but just he kept dropping into my life over the years, and every solitary time he would just leave a blessing of some sort. And I thought to myself, if all of God's people, just wherever they went, they didn't say, well, what's the point of getting to know people here? What's the point of even joining this church? We'll only live here a year. Or, what's the point of getting to really know my neighbors? We're going to probably put this house on the market in 2 or 3 years from now. You miss all the opportunities along the pathway of your life to leave a blessing. And so that's why Jeremiah was saying, look, just settle down. Like, be a blessing to the city that you're in. And I would say, if you're in a neighborhood, if you belong to an HOA, if you're just know the neighbors that live next to you. We had to cut down a tree the other day, or have a tree cut down, and neighbor, I was getting one tree cut down, and my neighbor on the one side of me, Dean, came over and said, hey, he pointed out a tree that was on my property, but it was kind of leaning toward his house. And he was wondering about if I planned to cut that down, because he was a little nervous about it. And I had kind of had an eye on it, but since the tree cutters were there anyway, I just said, hey, what would you charge me to get rid of that tree too? And I hate cutting down trees. I like trees. I grew up on the flat prairies, and so I like trees. But they went ahead and cut that down. And my neighbor came back around and said, hey, that was, you kind of did that for me. And so what did that cost you? I'll be glad to share the cost of that. And I could have used the money, but I just said, that's fine. I want to be a good neighbor, basically, and I want to help you out and be a blessing. I want you to be glad that I live next to you. And and that same week, I had a hard time meeting my neighbor on the other side. He didn't live he owned the house, but he didn't live there for the first couple of years we were here. And then he travels a lot, and I do as well. And so I just never could catch him. We'd even leave stuff at his door and when he wasn't home, and just could never seem to connect. But I saw him in his backyard and kind of bustled over there to talk to him. And when we get talking, he's a Christian, and he's actually years ago actually studied experiencing God. And so I went and put one of our daily devotional books and left it in his mailbox, and just trying to be a blessing to him. He wrote me a real nice thank you note, and I'm like, I don't know. I hope that we live here for a while, but I just want my neighbors to be glad that I'm in this community. And so then, that means you keep your yard up, and you try to be a good neighbor, and you smile and wave at your neighbors, and you try to get to know them. And it's not, you don't think, well, is it worth it? Because I may not be here long. I'm here now. And so if I'm here now, God has a plan for my life now. And of course, then that goes to the same with the workplace. We've kind of touched on that, but you don't know how long you're going to have those particular employees or those particular colleagues, those particular customers. So just try to strive to be the kind of person that every time you have an encounter with those people, you try to be a steward of that time. And you just say, for now, they are my colleague, and so let me be a blessing to them. And I've shared before years ago when I was working at a psych hospital, but I had a very troubled nurse that was my immediate supervisor. And I've shared that story in earlier podcasts, but my first thought was, God, I definitely don't plan on working here very long, and this is just a job to get me through school. As soon as classes are done, I'm out of here. I'm not staying around a day longer than I have to. And it's a tough job. It's a night shift job. I'm just trying to endure it. Why invest in people that I'll never, ever see again once I leave the state, leave the country, and leave this line of work for the rest of my life? But you have to also say, but could there not be some divine appointments that God has scheduled for me, that I leave a lasting legacy of blessing with some people that maybe 20, 30 years later, they still remember the kindness of that Christian employee that was the only one that just treated me kindly, and they were a Christian, and they didn't get upset when I was in a bad mood, and when I didn't treat them right, they always treated me like Jesus. Could it be that even in passing, you have the opportunity to pass on a blessing in your workplace? Sometimes you're blessed to maybe work with the same people for 10, 20 years. Other times, maybe it's 6 months. But in just a short period of time, is there a blessing that you could impart? And I think in part that's what Jeremiah was saying, God was saying through Jeremiah to these folks is, you're living as if you're just putting your life on hold until you get to the place you want to be. Yeah. But where are you today? Where has God put you today? He's got a purpose for you today. And so settle down. Stop just thinking about you'll start living, you'll start being happy once you have this in place. And say, well, how would you live today well? How would you be a blessing to people today? And if you live your life like that every day, you're going to look back 30, 40 years from now, and you're going to leave just a massive trail of blessed, grateful people that they crossed paths with you along the way. And that's a great way to live. And I think that's a way that honors God. And so, yeah, God does have good things in store for you. He does have thoughts towards you for your good and for the good of others. But it might not necessarily be what you hoped. For these people, it was 70 years of exile. That didn't sound like God having good things in store. For them, good things in store would have been you're hiking back to Jerusalem starting tomorrow. A lot of those people never did. They never did return to Jerusalem. They died of old age before they ever made it back. But that doesn't mean that God didn't have a lot of good stuff for them anyway. And if they had waited to live until they got back to Jerusalem, they wouldn't have lived any more the rest of their life. And life's too brief to say, I'll start living when. You need to say, I'm going to start living now, where God has me today. And I think when you approach life with that attitude, you'll be surprised at how much joy you can get, even from places that you aren't going to be for very long.
Yeah. Well, what a great reminder and legacy. What better legacy to leave than a legacy of blessing, no matter where you are, no matter where God has you. So, as always, thanks for taking the time, Richard.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.